Hello everyone. Hi Dharani, hi Kavita. Hi everybody. Welcome to our live session today on because of the International Yoga Day. We are doing a live session on what is Vinyasa Krama, and also we're going to talk about Vinyasa Krama with different teachers around the world. And we have Ayan today, so it's just joined. First of all, very happy International Yoga Day to everyone. It's on the 21st of June, and we're doing a series of events from today and until the end of June to actually share. Hi, Ayan, welcome. I love your
Hello,
background
hello.
picture. Nice. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good too. Thank you so much, and welcome to Atma Yogashala Live. And thanks for joining in today because it's an interesting event. We're going to share a lot about Vinyasa Krama and a lot about yoga in the coming events, in the coming IGTV Live. So, first one, I'm going with you. It's so happy and to see you after a long time. It's great to connect with the
Likewise,
community.
likewise.
Yeah. Right. So, I think we already have people joining in. Guys, if you have any question through the session, you can always type it in and we will try and answer your questions right and when we see it. Or you can reserve this question to the end of session as well. We'll have 30 minutes session on this. And we're going to ask Ayan how he explored Vinyasa Krama, how he discovered and what is special about this. So that's the kind of topic and talk we're going to have today. All right, so let's get into it. So, do you want to introduce yourself first? Where are you from? What do you
Do
do? How
I?
did you get into?
I don't know.
Yes, please.
I hope you don't mind. I'm having my cup of tea right now.
It's
But
okay. This is called
yeah,
chai
let's
time.
let's just
Vinyasa
yeah.
Krama
I
chai
mean,
time.
all time is chai time.
Yes.
Yeah, let's make this an informal, interactive talk. You can always stop me in my tracks whenever you want and ask
Okay.
me questions if you want.
Sure.
All right, so okay, so yeah, as I introduced myself in the profile, I'm a nurse by profession, and I've been practicing yoga for the past 9 years and teaching for the past 7 years. So
That's
yeah, I think that's
amazing.
that's
Okay.
all you need to know.
Okay. Okay. That's all I need to know. Okay. I know a lot more about you, but let's keep it short
Yeah,
for this
yeah, I
one.
think we can keep it that way.
Yeah. So, okay. So, how did you start yoga? Forget about the Vinyasa Karma practice, but how did you actually end up doing yoga practice? Because you're in the Philippines, and how much was it like popular there, or is it something you were curious? How did you start?
Well, yeah, as I've mentioned, it was around like 2014 or around the end of 2013 when I started yoga.
Mm-hmm.
It was just really a way to keep myself fit because I used to, um, most of my students who are here right now know that I used to play basketball varsities back in college. And so I came from a sports background, and you know how it is with us athletes. When we stop competing and when we stop training, we still continue to eat like athletes. So so I
Yeah.
didn't want to I didn't want to gain weight. So I continued going to the gym, but I didn't want to bulk up either. So what I did was I did alternate training. So on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I lifted weights, and on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, I did cardio. And my friend, who happened to be my training partner at that time, taught yoga in the same gym we went to. And so he was like, okay, since it's your cardio day, why don't you try yoga? And I was like, no way, that's for women, and that's like for older people, and it looks boring.
Yeah.
But
That's the
long
most
story
general
short,
misconception we have, right, about yoga. Yeah.
it
Okay.
is, sadly, yeah, it is. But
Mm.
yeah, even for me. And yeah, long story short, I was on my second down dog, and I was sweating my A off, and it
Mm-hmm.
was hard. And I like challenges, so I ended up going in the next few classes. Ended up going twice a week, and then thrice a week, and then end up just going regularly.
Okay. Okay. Nice. So, what actually? made you stay in the practice? Because a lot of people try yoga and they give up, or they move to another practice. What made you to stick to the practice, and how did you move from whatever style you started to Vinyasa Krama?
So yeah, to be honest, it was probably because of my medical background as a healthcare professional. So when I met my second teacher, who I spent a lot of time with, who I think also where I had my most growth in my yoga practice when I was practicing with him. He's from Rohtak, India, around 2 hours from Delhi. And once he started talking about the deeper aspects of yoga, the deeper aspects of even just the asana practice, started to explain it in such a way where there's sort of like a blurred line between the traditional forms of yoga and modern medicine. So that really caught my attention. And so, yeah, I think from there, the rest is history. It just caught my attention, and I just wanted to learn more and more and more. And he was also the first person who actually introduced the practice of bandhas. And I think that's the most specific practice that really caught my attention, the bandhas.
Okay. So we're going to talk about the bandhas. I'm going to have a question for you about the bandhas later. But so what style were you practicing in the beginning?
Well, like most of us, it was purely for exercise and to keep ourselves fit.
Fit, right?
Yeah. So it was mostly vinyasa.
Okay.
Mostly vinyasa.
Vinyasa.
But the way he taught was he changed the classes a lot. Like there was no one class that's the same. So he was at one point he was teaching maybe mostly arm balances, and then at some point he taught mostly flexibility classes, and then sometimes he mixes those things up. And there was a lot of variety in those classes, and that's what I enjoyed about it. It was never boring. There was so many different things that we
that you can
discussed.
Explore. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so, yeah, I think it was mostly vinyasa for me. I never really got into different practices he taught hatha, classical hatha once in a while, but mostly it was vinyasa.
Vinyasa. So can you, in layman terms, tell what is vinyasa for a lot of people who are new to this practice, and how you move from vinyasa to vinyasa krama? There are two different things, and I think most of them confused when we spoke about vinyasa krama. They say, "Oh, I've done vinyasa yoga." So, can you try and speak about this in your layman term, like say vinyasa? What is vinyasa, and what is vinyasa krama? If you wanna.
Well, okay. So nowadays, the yoga practice, or let's just say yoga. Let's just use yoga as a term for asana practice. But the physical practice of yoga, most of the time, one of the most popular practices nowadays is Vinyasa yoga. So Vinyasa yoga is roughly translated again nowadays as breath coordinated movement. So you flow through different postures, one posture at a time, following a specific breath pattern. So generally, it's how I teach my students. Generally, it's when you're doing expansive movements. When you're moving away from the center, you do an inhale, and when you're doing compressive movements, you do an exhale. But what makes it so popular nowadays is that when vinyasa, at least the modern vinyasa, is taught, is that it prepares us for more difficult postures, more challenging postures. And I think
that's
exciting.
Yeah.
Yes, that's where the excitement comes from. So yeah, people are like, oh, we're preparing for handstand, we're preparing for headstand, we're doing all those cool things that we see on Instagram or YouTube.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what vinyasa is. It's like you're preparing your body, at least from a physical perspective, for a more challenging posture.
How did you move from vinyasa to vinyasa krama? What's the journey?
Okay, so I think I'm gonna have to go back to my teacher here, because as they say, the teacher points you to the direction but doesn't tell you what to see. And yeah, so after my first 200-hour teacher training, which I did in Rishikesh, where most people go.
You do, yes.
So yeah, so I went to visit my teacher in Rohtak. And at that time, I think he had just finished his training with Ramaswamy sir, our teacher at that time. It was around 2016. And when I came to visit him and practiced with him and actually did my very first class out of graduation from my 200-hour training there, so I did some practices with him and I noticed that it was a lot different. So we did all the Hasta Vinyasas, which we'll talk about later. He incorporated it with the warrior sequence, and I was like, this is something new. I mean, I haven't seen him teach this before, or I haven't experienced this style of yoga before. And so, yeah, after the class, we talked about it. I was like, what style was that? And he said, yeah, Vinyasa Krama. I learned it from Krishnamacharya's longest standing student outside of his family and so on. And I was like, as a new teacher, as someone who just finished his training, so I asked him, would you recommend that to me? Would you recommend that I go train with Ramaswamy sir? Would I be able to keep up knowing that I had just finished my 200-hour training and I know very little about yoga? And he said, yeah, definitely. It's a style of yoga that you can apply to pretty much anyone and everyone. And so, yeah, I taught for another like 2 or 3 years, and then everything just came into place 2019. I did one teacher training in Borneo, in Sabah, with my other teacher, Gokula Chandra. And after that, it was just one after the other. After the training, there was like a week break. And then it was the training where I met you, the first time I met you in Chennai. And yeah, so as soon as I did that training, I think from there on, I just never looked back. I had just been practicing Vinyasa Krama almost exclusively now.
That's amazing. So what is the first thing which comes to your mind when you think Vinyasa Krama, how different it is from the other style? Just the one, let's say one line if you want to say.
I'd say...
It's difficult, I know, but try.
Well, yeah. Yeah, it's hard to put it in one word, but I'd say breath focus. You rarely see that breath. Yeah, it's breath priority. You rarely see that in modern day yoga nowadays. Again, I'm not trying to put anything down, but this is what differentiates. This is what's so unique about Vinyasa Krama.
Why breath focus is important? Why do you think? Because you also come from a medical background. Why you think that changed something about your practice or changed something about your perception about yoga? Why breath focus changed it for you?
Well, first of all, before Ramaswamy sir's discussion or lecture about yoga for the internal organs, I've had this, how do I say this? I've always been sort of like interested about how the breath changes not just our psyche but our physical practice and just so many things that, because as a healthcare professional, as a medical practitioner, you might notice that almost every single time that you visit a doctor or you're in distress and the medical team arrives, the first thing that they always tell you is to breathe deep. It's not like, okay, take this aspirin or something. It's always, okay, take deep breaths, take deep breaths. Even the doctors do that.
Right.
And so just that alone, I think it's very interesting how these medical professionals who have all the technology in their hands tells you to use the very primitive technology that you have in your own body, which you can control and which is for free, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah, it is free at least until now. So, okay. So, do you want to little bit talk more about the Vinyasa Krama style itself? Like, what are the components of it? What do you practice in a daily routine? What is more attractive to you, and what keeps you doing this again and again? What is like the most important components of the Vinyasa Krama practice?
I think I think I'm gonna be saying this a lot tonight, or at least it's tonight here in my place. Again, it will always go back to the breath.
Mm-hmm.
I had just finished teaching a pranayama and meditation class earlier today,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I've noticed that I think it was Ramaswamy sir who said this, that again, breath is not just essential to the practice, but it is central to the practice. And he made mention that all the other yogas, because for those of you here in the audience who don't know, not all yoga practitioners, especially the traditional yoga practitioners, actually practice asanas, or the physical practice of yoga.
Yeah.
You have your bhakti yoga yogis, the devotees, you have your gyan yogis, the academics, you know, so the karma yogis, so many different styles of yoga who don't actually practice, you know, headstands or, you know, child's pose even, but they all practice pranayama. They all practice breath control. So that's another thing that's really interesting about this. So yeah, I think it will all go back to the breath. Each time we practice, or I practice personally, it took me some time to really get the hang of this, to rest in the middle of the practice and take your shavasana until your breath is smooth again.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, as I continue to study, especially the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, I realized how important this is, and I realized why he kept on mentioning about the breath, especially in the asana part of the practice, which not many people know of nowadays.
Can you
But yeah, I
so
think
just sorry to interrupt. I want to also, because every posture we are breathing, so maybe people in the audience don't understand the importance of what breath is in Vinyasa Krama. Can you explain how the posture and the breath is linked in Vinyasa Krama so that there is more understanding to it and what we're talking, it makes sense?
right. Okay. So for those of you who are new to the practice, I see some of my students here as well. And yeah, if you notice, most of the time when you go into a studio class nowadays, of course we're reminded to, okay, always be with the breath, let the breath guide your movement. But the main thing here is nowadays, we come in a group class and we're breathing very shallow. You can even see that even in the Surya Namaskar practice, even in the sun salutation practice, where people just flow, okay, inhale, lift your hands up, and then exhale, bow. They go into almost some sort of a flow state.
Yeah.
But what happens there is that, you know, yes, your movement is guided by the breath, but is that the way you breathe naturally when you're in a state of rest? Is that the way you breathe when you're watching Netflix and, you know, just laying on the couch? No, because a lot of times we are only given an hour of practice. So, you know, we tend to rush from one posture to another. And then, you know, even as teachers, I'm also guilty of this. Sometimes we need to rush from one posture to another just to finish our sequence.
Yeah.
So now the breath takes a back seat in the practice, which shouldn't be the case if we follow the ancient scriptures of yoga.
Right.
But again, this is what makes Vinyasa Krama unique, because there's never a time in Vinyasa Krama where the breath takes a back seat. All of the time, the movement follows the breath. When you're not breathing, you're not moving. Your movement stops before the breath stops. Right?
I also
And then,
enjoy the way Ramaswamy sir says your breath, your movement is a subset of your breath. Your breath is, you start inhale and you start your movement. You finish your movement and you finish your inhale or exhale, you know.
absolutely.
So trying to
Yes.
keep the movement within the breath. So your breath naturally tends to get longer and the movement is like encompassed within it. It's like a package inside the breath. But in other styles of
Definitely.
yoga where it is like we inhale, even if you're taking the hands up, we inhale for like 2 seconds, but we continue to move, either exhaling or, you know, holding the breath, you know. But in Ramaswamy class, even I remember when I taught the class with him, you are too fast. You know, he said, I'm too fast. Slow down So inhale, he took like 5, 6, 7 seconds to raise the arms up in Tadasana sequence. It's like literally slowing you down by focusing on the breath so that you're also focusing. You're like, okay, slow down, slow down, slow down. You're not racing in your mind. Yeah. Yeah.
That was really new to me when I first did the training, the advanced teacher training that we did. I was like, what? How do we sweat like this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but then
It's more
ultimately,
like, yeah, it's more like you're trying to access your subtle energy through the asana, which was very familiar for me because I lived in China. So it's like more the Tai Chi sense coming into, trying to
yeah.
find the connection there. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry to cut you off. Yeah. Please go on. And how
No,
you,
that was beautifully put. I almost forgot about how Sir actually described the breath and the movement. Yeah.
So
But
in Vinyasa Krama, we're talking about like every movement is connected to the breath. And there is, in some of the places where it's so logical. So when you're jumping or when you are doing a movement, there is a hold aspect of it. And so I have never experienced a hold aspect in a different kind of practice or in a hatha yoga. No, but there's no hold in asana practice. So even in downward facing dog, when Ramaswamy sir says, exhale and hold the breath outside. Even in Surya Namaskara, there is inhale, hold,
which
exhale,
most
hold.
people struggle now.
Yeah, so sometimes I don't even teach with the hold. I teach only with the flow of breath because it's very difficult to hold the breath. That's when the prana inside is like extending. So this aspect, these are very new concepts because most of the time we've been taught to do pranayama is good. But I felt like Ramaswamy sir actually broke down and said, why pranayama is good? Why Ujjayi is good? Like a lot of, So I understand when you say breath. So for me, it's also one of the fascinating part of Vinyasa Krama.
Yeah.
As a medical practitioner, what else in the practice itself, in the dynamic movements, attracted you to the practice, or in the static movements, you felt a difference? So what do you feel like with these two different types of movements?
Well, you know what? I'd like to talk about this because this was something I recently discovered when Sir started talking about yoga for the internal organs, which is an unpublished article, I think. But you and I both have copies of this. But funny thing, I'll tell you a story. I think it was just about 2 weeks ago. One student told me, because right now, even if when I teach beginners classes or I teach classical hatha, I put some elements of Vinyasa Krama in it because, of course, not many people know about Vinyasa Krama just yet. And then one student approached me and told me that, you know what, because you know how people wear those fit watches nowadays, smart watches, and it tells you your pulse rate and your blood pressure and even your ECG for some. And so this student approached me, although I try to tell people not to wear that during class because it throws them off. But one student approached me after class and she told me, you know what, this was the first class that I've attended, and I've attended so many, where my watch didn't warn me of, increasing blood pressure and increasing heart rate. And yeah, that opened my eye even more to this practice of how subtle, at the same time healthy this practice is. So with that said, I'm just going to go on and talk about how and why asana is practiced. So I'm going to start off because this is where most people start their practice in. And so when we practice asanas, this is what makes yoga unique from other fitness modalities, because a lot of times when people talk about health and wellness, we usually default to circulation. I think we can all really agree that good circulation leads to better health.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's good to move. There are actually two ways to improve circulation. First of all is through, different fitness modalities. Like, for instance, increasing the heart rate. Like if you go for a jog or if you go to the gym, if you lift heavy weights, it increases your heart rate. due to the demand of your body. And so that way, that improves circulation throughout your body. And then there's this yoga approach. The yoga approach is to improve circulation, but without having to strain the heart. Because the heart, as a muscle, the heart is a muscle, for those of you who don't know, can also get exhausted at some point. But through yoga, through asana practice, the physical practice, the physical component of yoga, we can improve circulation without having to strain the heart. Now, how does this go? You have 3 different techniques. First of all, well, I'm just going to talk about it from a medical perspective. First of all, you have your muscle pump reflex, where your muscles squeeze and relax, squeeze and relax. First of all, to improve blood flow towards the heart itself. And once there's good or enough amount of, or enough supply of blood to the heart, then it doesn't have to beat as intensely to bring that blood back into circulation. Now, what is this muscle pump reflex in terms of yoga? These are our vinyasas. These are the different movements that we do in a certain posture. Like Sir would always say, okay, in Marichasana, there are, say for instance, 12 different vinyasas or 16 different vinyasas. That means that we are involving as much muscles as we can in a certain pose. We're not just staying there, staying still in a certain pose. We're doing twists, we're doing side bends, we're doing forward bends in a pose, we're doing back bends in a pose. So now we're involving more and more muscles each time. And again, that improves blood flow towards the heart. And then the heart doesn't need to beat as intensely to bring that blood back into circulation. So that's one. The next is you have your inversions, your Viparita Karani Mudras, as we call it. So inversions, we call this gravitational pump. Because throughout the day, our hearts are located, when we're upright, high above our chest, towards the head. It's away from the ground. That means it's always working against gravity to bring blood back into itself. And so through Viparita Karani Mudras, through inversions, headstands, shoulder stands. I'm not even going to mention handstands or Pincha Mayurasana, but headstands, shoulder stands. That way we bring the heart closer to the ground. And now we're working with gravity. We're using the power of gravity to, again, bring the blood from our lower extremities, especially, back into the heart. And now the heart doesn't have to beat as fast or as intensely once again. So again, improve circulation while the heart is resting. And then finally, my favorite probably among all the techniques, deep breathing, and maybe even a little bit of bandhas, Uddiyana Bandha. Deep breathing, basically just simply expanding our chest fully, our rib cage, our thoracic cavity fully. And I think it's simple physics. Most of us know this, you know, matter or fluids and gas flow from an area of greater concentration to lesser concentration. So we actually expand our chest, lower the pressure so that it sort of like serves as a vacuum to draw fluids into that cavity, into that part of your body where the heart is located.
Correct.
So if you've seen photos of Sri Krishnamacharya, our teacher's guru, you'll see his chest just expand so big and he's pulling his belly in Uddiyana Bandha.
Yeah, that's kind of also looks impossible when you say it, you know, but Uddiyana Bandha has such effect in your practice. It just changes the way you even stand or sit, or, you know, your spine gets super straight when you do Uddiyana Bandha, like very naturally. So it's just like an amazing practice. I think that kind of comes only after you have a little bit of an, let's say, experience with asana and breath. Only then the bandha becomes accessible to many people. So I think when we wait patiently with the asana practice and the breath practice, and then when the bandha hits, that's when everything like flips, you know. So changes inside you, and you understand, oh, this is what they are talking about before, you know.
It's a very profound and complete practice. And this one thing about Vinyasa Krama is, I think it's because it's at least from a modern yoga perspective, from modern postural yoga perspective, it's probably the system that has stuck with what the ancient text talks about. Especially, like for instance, let's just narrow it down and oversimplify it. Let's just talk about the Yoga Sutras. Let's forget the Garand Samhita and Hatha Yoga Pradipika and everything else. Let's just stick with the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Patanjali made mention of the 5 parameters of asana practice. In fact, out of 196 verses, he only talked about asanas in 3 verses. And of 2 of these verses, he was basically just giving us the parameters of the asana practice, the physical component of yoga. And first of all, I think most of us or most yoga practitioners are familiar with sthira and sukham nowadays, which is the steadiness and comfort. But a lot of people don't talk about the next 3 parameters that he talked about in the 47th verse of the 2nd chapter, where he said prayatna shaitilya ananta samapatibhyam, where he is talking about prayatna. Some teachers would interpret prayatna as conscious effort, but it's different with Ramaswamy and with his guru Sri Krishnamacharya, because they talk about prayatna as jivana prayatna, one of the efforts that we have in our lives. Right? So it's the effort that sustains life, jivana prayatna, which basically means the breath. And then you have your sitilya. Sitilya is your, basically, moving away from effort towards ease, basically smoothness of the breath. And then the most important one, which supports, again, the next practices, because, mind you, well, at least yoga supposedly is a very well-structured practice, but we tend to, make our own practices, based on our own understandings without the guidance of a teacher. And so we get, the knowledge gets distorted. But if we just follow this, ananta samapati, samapati means complete mental absorption. Right? To something that never ends. And what doesn't end until, the time we pass on or we die, it's our breath. We always go back to the breath. So basically, Patanjali tells us that when you're practicing your asanas, keep your mind to your breath. Don't look elsewhere. Keep your mind to your breath. And this is one thing I thought about last night when I was thinking about this practice. I was like, you know what? I could discuss this in terms of modern science, or I can discuss yoga as a shastra, as a science in itself, where it's a science that leads us towards mental clarity, towards absolute peace of mind, or towards samadhi, hopefully.
Yeah. But I think that is what is kind of lacking, because when Ramaswamy sir explains it like this, there's a logical progression to understanding of what is doing, like asana. So he just doesn't finish. Many people explain it stiram and sukham, and that is where the explanation finishes for asana. When this prayatna sitilam and ananta samapatibhyam comes in, it totally changes the way you should practice the asana. So that is
Absolutely.
where I think there's a lot of bridge being connected. And from the talk of yoga, like the mythological concept of yoga, you actually are hitting the ground and say, oh, I can understand with my mind. It's not something like, okay, the energy is going to rise up and there is something going to happen in my chakras. No, it's just so clear. The way he speaks, it's hits you right there and tells you, okay, this is why you practice yoga. This is how you practice asana. Focus on your breathing and try to completely absorb your mind through your breathing of ujjayi when you're doing the practice. And inhale where you have to inhale, exhale where you have to exhale. And that will change everything within you. And eventually you can go into a more static practice. That's before actually going there, I want to ask you, can you explain in terms of the dynamic movements having the effect, like you spoke of the muscle pump thing, and then what else is the dynamic movement doing to us? What else is the dynamic stretching doing to our body?
So I'm just going to oversimplify because we don't have a lot of time to discuss the nuances of this practice compared to the other practices. But basically, it's just reminding our bodies and our minds on how the pose looks like towards the end. So you might have, for some athletes, you might have seen that, in the past years, athletes just go into regular static stretching before they start their practice. And now, over the years, they have discovered that first you start with a little bit of dynamic stretching
Stretching.
before you go into static stretching.
Why
In the
is that?
same way, again, it's for muscle memory and it's for mental memory as well. Like you're telling your body, okay, this is how this pose should go. This is how your body feels when you're
Should
in the
feel
pose.
posture. Yeah.
You might notice that, if you practice yoga early in the morning, you start off really stiff. Imagine trying to go into your Paschimottanasana, you're seated forward bend, first thing in the morning.
Yeah. Even downward dog is like, okay, second downward dog feels better, Yeah.
You're not going to enjoy your practice. But then, a few movements later, maybe moving into it 3 times, of course, following the breath, then it becomes more accessible. And this is what I love about this practice. I'm not flexible at all, but through this system where we're following the breath, at the same time, I'd like to talk about this, Joshna. Our sympathetic nervous, or our nervous system in general, is closely tied to our breath. So generally, when we inhale, the sympathetic, the fight or flight, the stress response kicks in. It creates a little bit of tension in our body. So the muscles are more stiff, a little bit. And when we exhale, the parasympathetic, our rest state kicks in. And so what happens when we're in a rest and relaxed state? The muscles are more relaxed, making it easier to stretch. Imagine pairing that with long, smooth exhales as we do in Vinyasa Krama. So now our muscles have more time to be in a relaxed state to stretch with very little effort because, again, we go back to Sitilia, smoothness, and moving away from effort towards ease. And I think this is where Vinyasa Krama really makes a difference, at least in the physical practice of yoga.
I also notice when you do dynamic practice, the injuries you get is much less compared to you go into a posture and just stay there. When you do it dynamically a couple of times, if you're very stiff, let's say you're doing it 3 or 4 times, and then you stay in the posture for 5 or 6 breaths, that is when I feel like you're kind of healing your injuries in a way. For me, that happened magically because I was practicing a different style before I came to Vinyasa Krama. I came into teacher training of Sir directly from that practice to here, and I've injured myself through asana practice there. So when I came into it, in 2 weeks, not just the injury disappeared, I was able to go into a posture much more smoothly without any struggle. So I felt like, okay, there is this dynamic movement which is helping. Combined with the breathing, it is making me more easier. And also I feel like there is both strength and flexibility is working in pairs, For example, when you're bending forward, you're working, let's say, on hamstring flexibility, right? When you're coming up, you're actually like using the strength of it to come up. So you're trying to pair it on with the Salamba and Niralamba variations, So for me, the dynamic aspects also kind of gave me a little bit more perspective why we need to do a lot more even before staying. And then it's like the cherry is static posture, and you stay and you stay and you stay for your like first 5 minutes. You're thinking when this 5 minutes is going to get over. And then you're like, wow, that is 5 minutes. That was fast, So what do you like about the static practice and how you approach it? If an absolute beginner come into your class, how do you approach a static practice?
To be honest, yeah, it's the same. I put a lot of Vinyasa Krama elements in my teaching now. So again, I don't just go straight into the static postures, but ultimately I still follow the 4 essential postures that we do in Vinyasa Krama, although I don't teach much of the Mahamudra because not a lot of people understand it yet.
Yeah.
But then again, there's a lot of preparation that comes before going into a static posture. And as you've mentioned, it's sort of like warming up the muscles first because it's kind of hard to stretch something when it's cold,
Right.
I think it's common sense, really. Well, a lot of Vinyasa Krama is common sense, really. Once you start to understand it, you'd be like, oh, yeah, yoga makes sense.
Yeah.
Even the 8 limbs of yoga itself is a vinyasa. It's arranged in a specific way where the previous step, this is what I wanted to talk about. I mean, if we talk about the more subtle parts of the practices, where you prepare yourself for the next step, and then you prepare yourself for the next step, until you get to that point where you're closer to samadhi, hopefully, and get that samadhi capabilities.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, for the static practice, I think it's only for people who have done a little bit more dynamic movements. And yeah, so we also introduce in our school very slowly the static practices. Very few people do the headstand for 5 minutes, shoulder stand for 5 minutes. The rest of them are still working on the vinyasas so that they can be more comfortable with their body when they come to static, and it's not a painful process. And also something when I talk about pain, I feel like Vinyasa Krama kind of it's not a painful process because everybody can start at where they are, you know. So
Right, right.
a beginner, absolute beginner, can just do the Tadasana movements and finish a 45-minute practice only with doing Tadasana. And an advanced practitioner can do a headstand dynamic movement, all different variations of leg, and do a 45 minutes kind of practice where you're standing kind of upside down, doing all these kind of movements. So it just opens up the space to everybody. Like everyone can practice. I don't have to be very proficient in asana practice, or I don't have to be very proficient in pranayama practice, but I can start here and I can also go there. There is like a very systemic flow towards it. So that's also something very exciting for me. What other aspects, like you said, you talk about breath, right? How much importance you give for a pranayama practice in your class, and how people are taking it when it comes to pranayama practice after doing the asanas?
Well, first of all, it takes a lot of explanation during the class. I take probably 10 or 15 minutes.
Minutes to
I
talk
know
about.
some students who hate that part. I've
What do you
had
do about
students
it?
tell me, "Oh, I don't need to tell you, or I don't need you to teach me how to breathe." I've had those kinds of comments before, but I don't like that you take 15 minutes off of our physical practice to explain all these things. But then again, I think it's essential. It's very important to the practice, where you need to understand why are you doing this in the first place. Otherwise, you're just going to be, following the teacher blindly. I'm not trying to create a cult here or anything. Otherwise, they'd just be blindly following me. But you know what? Again, I think pranayama is probably the most important, if not, one of the most important parts of the practice. And like, again, I'm just gonna go back to Patanjali. I'm just gonna wash my hands on this. I'm not the one saying this. Patanjali did. So if you have any complaints, if you have any violent reactions, please feel free to contact him
Patanjali.
somewhere.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
you know what? Again, going back to the main definition of yoga is absolute peace of mind. If we oversimplify this practice again, yoga practice is a practice, at least the 8 limbs of yoga as we know it, is a practice that leads us towards meditative states. And Krishnamacharya understood this, and Patanjali understood this, that, not all people are capable of going straight into meditation. Like,
Right.
for instance, for us modern people, we can't sit comfortably for 2 minutes before we start to stretch our legs and our
Or
legs
look
start
at
to
our
fall asleep on
phones.
us. Right? Or look at our phones.
Phones, yes.
So yeah, Patanjali understood this, and he gave us a system that prepares us exactly for meditation. So again, I'm not going to talk about samadhi. I'm just going to go into a more realistic goal of meditation. How do I meditate efficiently and with very minimal effort, rather than just, waking up, opening my eyes, and then sitting down, and then closing my eyes, and then focusing on my object. So now this is where pranayama comes. And Patanjali made mention of this in I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the 53rd verse of the 2nd chapter. He mentions of Dharana Sucha Yogyata Manasaha, where he said, out of all the techniques, he specifically mentioned that it is through pranayama that the mind becomes fit for meditation. He didn't say, okay, stay in child's pose for 10 minutes and you become fit for meditation. He didn't say, okay, do handstand. He specifically said, practice your pranayama, and that prepares your mind for meditation. So now this is where pranayama bridges the physical or the external practices and the internal practices.
Practices.
So now we move from the external practice towards the more subtle practices, towards the internal practices.
How do, okay, so like you said, for beginners, what do you teach them like Kapalabhati or Nadishodhana when you come into pranayama practices? And then how do you think they approach it? Will they do it? Or if for you, because you live in a different country, so I understand from a different perspective, and I would like to know how they approach it and how do you convince them to do it? Do you give them ice creams
It's a
after
hard question.
practice?
I never really thought about it, but I think it helps that you actually explain it from a medical perspective.
Yeah.
So it's like, for instance, Kapalbhati, you just talk about it as a cleansing practice. So to remove that stale air in your lungs, sort of, so that as you introduce fresher air, you empty the lungs first from all the impurities and what other stale breath that's left there. So that way, again, it most of the time it clicks on the students. Oh yeah, I'm not breathing fully all the time, so I might need to clear my lungs a little bit. At the same time, clear the tubes. That means the nostrils, the bronchi, and all the tubes that brings the air to my lungs. So it's like a forceful exhale. It's sort of like, when you put the holes on the straw and then you compress the straw a little bit, and then the airflow is a lot faster and more powerful. It's the same concept, really. And again, it makes so much sense, but I'm very careful when I teach this, especially because a lot of people nowadays, they don't tell you when you ask in the beginning of the class, oh, do you have any medical issues? Do you have any injuries? Some people don't tell you until the end of the class when they're feeling something bad.
Right. And sometimes even after 3 months, I would not know what conditions they have. So we also have to be very careful. So yeah.
Yes. So basically, just generally, when it comes to pranayama practice, the main thing there as a medical practitioner is that you don't put unnecessary stress in any part of your body. And this is also why I find, I'm just gonna sidetrack a little bit. This is why I find that Krishnamacharya's style of teaching Uddiyana Bandha or bandhas after the exhale makes more sense and is safer to practice. Because, if you have vascular issues, if you have weak veins, imagine, inhaling where you have extra pressure in your body with all that air. Imagine your body is a balloon, and then you put all that air in it, and then you try to compress that balloon. It's, at some point it's going to pop.
Right.
Same goes with your veins. When there's extra pressure, extra tension, not just your veins, it also involves your joints, your muscles, every part of your body. You don't want extra tension.
So yeah, for people who are watching, Uddiyana Bandha is when you exhale and you compress your belly in as much as you can and hold the breath out. So usually in Krishnamacharya style of practicing, we do holding the breath out after we exhale, not after we inhale. So this comes as a big part of pranayama practice. So when you do like a lot of asanas and then come to pranayama, every pranayama is done with the bandha, with Uddiyana Bandha, Moola Bandha, Jalandhara Bandha. The bandhas are like, do you want to explain a little bit about bandhas, Ian, also in terms of like in a scientific way and how you relate to it, and talk about it a little bit more so people have an idea of how we use bandhas in Vinyasa Krama practices?
I'll try to make this quick.
Okay.
But yeah, generally bandhas are locks, right? So they're energetic locks. Basically, they're a way to keep your energy inside your body. So you have we usually talk about 3 bandhas in this tradition. So you have your Jalandhara Bandha, so you keep your energy from moving up and out your body. And then you have your Moola Bandha, it's that action of holding your pee in when you don't want to pee yet, and when you don't have a toilet close to you and you try to hold your pee in, you call that Moola Bandha. So basically it's preventing your energy from exiting the lower orifices. And then you have your Uddiyana Bandha, which is more of diverting this energy towards your spine, towards the Shushumna. For
Center.
those of you who are not familiar, it's the main energy channel. So yeah, so you have these three bandhas. First of all, you prevent your energy from exiting the
Out.
higher orifices. And then you have your Mula bandha to prevent your energy from moving out the lower orifices. And then you have your Uddiyana bandha to push the energy towards your spine.
Center.
But Sir explained this in a way that changed my practice as well. Because first of all, again, a lot of people talk about, keep a straight spine, but we're never taught how to do that.
Right.
We're always just taught to, okay, tuck your tailbone in, and that's pretty much it. Pull your chin in towards your chest, that's pretty much it. But Sir talked about this in a physical perspective of a bandha, or of the bandhas. First of all, you might not see it in your Uddiyana or in your Mula bandha. You might not notice it, but as soon as you contract your perineum, your pelvic floor, that corrects the slight curve of your tailbone. So the bottom part of the spine is, or at least the curve, because the spine is naturally curved. There are 4 curves of the spine. So now the bottom curve of the spine is made less prominent through your Mula bandha. And now you have your Uddiyana bandha. If you notice, your lower back is arched. And so now when you pull your belly in towards your spine, it pushes that part of your spine towards the back. Again, it makes that arch in your lower back less prominent, and a lot of people have problems with their lower backs.
Right.
So now you have your Uddiyana bandha as a technique to use different muscles so that you won't need to just manually try to correct that curve in your spine.
Right.
And now you have your Jalandhara bandha, where you tuck your chin in, that corrects this curve on your neck, on your cervical spine. But still, there's one more very important curve, the highest or the biggest curve in your thoracic spine. So in your mid and upper back. So how do you correct it? You don't have a bandha for that, but you have your deep breathing. So when you breathe deep, you expand your chest fully. That makes the curve, the huge curve where some of us are slouching most of the time, especially when we're tired, when we breathe deep, then we correct that curve of our mid and upper back.
So bandha is not only working on the energy channels, which we call the nadis or the prana, the energy itself, but also work in the physical structure of the body, how we stand, how we sit, how we walk, correcting the posture. And it's beautifully explained. So there is a logic to why you're doing this bandha, so that's wonderful. So this is one of the kind of like a key takeaway for me as well when it comes to Vinyasa Krama practice, how each aspect of your physical, mental and spiritual gets affected by asana, by bandha, by pranayama. Yeah, so I think everyone is kind of impressed. Thank you everyone for that. Everyone is saying that's a great explanation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So that's the whole intention of
Appreciate
this the talk is to bring out the nuances of Vinyasa Krama, which we don't generally get a chance to talk in a group class, because we don't know how many people are kind of interested in it, because it will take a lot of our time when you explain this in a group class, and then some of them really look disinterested because it's not their time yet, or it's maybe they're busy in their work, so it's not. So this is like giving us more chance to actually interact with and know from each perspective, and how Ramaswamy sir actually puts this in practice. So thank you so much for that. Yeah. Okay. So
yeah. To add to that, I really want to talk about this because again, yoga practice is a practice, at least the 8 limbs of yoga that we practice as Hatha yogis or Hatha yoga practitioners, is a practice that leads towards meditative states. And in this way, I've also noticed how Vinyasa Krama is a very, very well-structured practice where from the very beginning, we're already training our minds to go into those meditative states. Like for instance, let's start with asana again, because asana is usually the starting point for most people. Asana, for those of you who don't know, it's the physical practice of yoga. This is your headstand, your warrior one, your warrior two, your child's pose, any seated position. So those are your asanas. In Vinyasa Krama, again, from the get-go, from the very beginning, in your asana practice, you're already told to watch your breath. So for those of you who don't know, I'd like to go over this real quick. In yoga, there is a mention of 3 transformations that happens when you practice yoga. First of all, you have your ekagrata parinama, which is your one-pointed focus, basically training your mind to be focused on one object, which not many people nowadays are capable of. Our minds are always jumping from one thought to another. Maybe right now you're listening to me, maybe 2 seconds later you're thinking about dinner or, what you had earlier for lunch. It's always jumping from one thought to another. But again, I'm not going to talk about the samadhi parinama where our minds are capable of complete mental absorption, or the nirodha parinama, the higher states. I'm just going to oversimplify. And
just 1 second, because it's in 3 minutes, yeah, sure. The live session will stop.
Okay,
so,
sure.
Yeah, so if you want to do it in 1 minute, or we'll go back again and start the live session again. Yeah.
I'll try.
Okay.
Okay, I'll try. But from the asana practice, from the very beginning, when all the movements are guided by the breath, so now we're already training our mind that when we're moving, no matter what disturbances from our bodies come, or from the external environment, we're already told to watch the breath. So no matter what disturbances come, the mind stays focused on the breath. So that when we get to the next stage of the practice, which is your pranayam, breath control, the mind is already there. So you're already training your mind towards pranayam, towards breath control. So it makes it easier. And now after pranayam, you have your shanmukhi mudra to end the pranayam practice, or some practice brahmari, which is your humming bee sound, which is basically your pratyahara, sense withdrawal. You're closing the entrance of your senses, right? And then you make maybe a humming sound, then you focus, instead of the sense of feeling or sense of touch, you focus on the vibrations you create internally. And so that way, now your senses are it's not really withdrawal of the senses, but it's basically to stop your senses from controlling your mind, instead of,
you're getting carried away by the senses.
Stay under control, right? And so now, once you've achieved all of that, because of that practice, now your mind is fit for concentration, your dharana, because you've been training your mind all along to just watch the breath.
Right.
And so in your dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, because dhyana is just basically dharana, but for a longer period of time. So now, when you practice your dharana, you just substitute the breath, which you've been focusing on all along, with your chosen object of contemplation. One that fits you, one that's neutral, one that's sattvic, a peaceful object of contemplation. And now, there you go. You're already in your meditation practice, right? So it's a very profound practice and a very well-structured practice that, prepares us again for this absolute peace of mind.
That was wonderful.
So, yeah, I think that's in a nutshell, that's the 8 limbs of yoga, really.
Yeah, I think the IG live also will finish by itself, because it's 1 hour, I think, every time. So, but before that, right. I would like to, if you want to continue, we can come back again in the live session. What do you suggest?
Well, it's up to you. If they have questions, I'd be happy to
Yeah, so what we'll do
them,
is we'll stop this live session and we have a Q&A.
Okay.
And the next one, maybe for next 10 minutes. So guys, shoot your question,
right.
Join us live again. We're going to end this and start a new one. So we have another 10 minutes for Q&A and we finish with that, okay? Thank you so much, Ayan.
See you in
love
a bit.
the conversation. I'll see you again.
Pleasure.
Please request again. We'll go live again. Thank you.
All right.